I feel like when conservatives talk about liberalism or liberals, they're referring to basically anybody from the Democrats all the way to the Bolsheviks, right? And I think, when leftists talk about liberals, we obviously mean something a little bit different. But I think even sometimes when we invoke liberalism, it's not always clear. I think sometimes when leftists say liberal, they really mean anybody less radical than me. Sometimes they mean anybody I don't like. So just to kind of kick off, before we get into the meat of your Atlantic pieces and your other writing, offer us a working definition of liberals or liberalism. When you criticize liberals, what exactly are you getting at?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. First time, long time. And I'm glad you added that caveat, because I was going to just reply, how much time have you got? But when I criticize liberals, I suppose predominantly what I'm talking about, what I'm referring to, is the strand, generalizing here a bit, but the strand of liberalism that's been embraced by the Democratic Party, I suppose going back to the late 1970s to some extent, but really kind of hungrily embraced by Democrats beginning in the Clinton era. And that's a type of liberalism that is much more zealous for kind of markets, politically speaking, in terms of its strategic calculations. It is much more, it embraces triangulation quite willingly and quite hungrily. It's also a type of liberalism that I think is associated with attempts to court particular demographics at the exclusion of others. So there's a great Jacobin piece from some years ago by Lily Geismer called Atari Democrats, where she talked about the realignment of the Democratic Party. It's something a lot of people have written about, obviously. It's kind of refashioning as a party of Silicon Valley and of Wall Street and of a particular kind of upper crust and heavily suburban constituency. And obviously you get a political shift to the right alongside those things. So that would be a kind of very brief working definition for our purposes.
So let's now dive into some of the, I guess, characteristics that you've been looking at in the Atlantic recently. So something that Paul had actually alluded to a couple minutes ago, and I think, is really interesting about your writing on liberalism and kind of like the state of liberals in the US, like during Trump and of course through to now, is you identify that liberals do this thing where oftentimes they'll use this very like kind of emergency state, like high-pitched rhetoric where it's like we're basically on the edge of societal collapse and descent into fascism like we've never seen before. There's very, very elevated rhetoric, but at the same time, they act totally powerless, right? So I want to read a quote from one of your Atlantic pieces. You write, "Liberalism in the Trump era has become a kind of strange pantomime act in which elite politicians deploy the rhetoric of imminent threats and national emergency only to behave like hapless passengers trapped aboard a sinking ship." I think that's really well put. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that tension. Why do they behave this way? And like, what explains this contradiction?
There are a number of ways to come at this. I think that type of rhetoric, the kind of rhetoric of emergency, that sort of thing, that really went into overdrive in 2015. It went into overdrive before Donald Trump was elected, kind of with his ascent. Although to a certain extent, it really is just a reflection of the way the media ecosystem and more broadly the political ecosystem in the United States has come to work. Beginning in the 90s with kind of Roger Ailes and Fox News, there was this discovery that instead of courting a mass market, you could actually have a sustainable media business model in courting a niche ideological market and kind of stoking it with, emotionally potent oversimplification and all the rest of it. Eventually, liberals discovered this. MSNBC, which of course originally was not a liberal network, it was kind of more like a CNN or something like that, and then through various sort of awkward Tim and Eric-y Keith Olbermann rants where he keeps weirdly turning to a different camera that's there for some reason and saying, "How dare you, sir?" MSNBC figured out that you could do this from kind of the liberal side as well. And of course, there are other factors at play here. But within that ecosystem, there is a really direct interest. There's a market incentive for big media oligopolies to use the rhetoric of emergency constantly. I mean, it's one reason people understand this on the Republican side, right? Republicans, Fox News in particular, has been describing the most vanilla liberal politicians. Joe Lieberman is Friedrich Engels to them, right? It's crazy, and I think on the liberal side, you've very much seen that as well. Now, of course, there also is, the American democracy in a kind of small d sense is genuinely under threat. Majority rule in the United States, which has always been a very fraught concept, is under a very active assault, particularly this year, from the Republican Party, which took the lesson from the 2020 presidential election. Essentially that, elections that Republicans don't win are inherently illegitimate and are pursuing a strategy, particularly at the state level, where there have been hundreds of these bills rolled out, to restrict voting rights, voter suppression bills, gerrymandering. There's one, I believe it was in Arizona, and I don't think it has passed, at least not yet, but that bill would give the state legislature, the power to overturn a Secretary of State's certification of electoral results. In other words, if there's a Democratic victory in that state in a presidential election, and then there's a Republican controlled legislature, they could simply overturn the results, which is, as far as I know, unprecedented. Although I could be wrong about that. There's a long history of counter-majoritarianism and just outright voter suppression in American history. But so, these two things can be very difficult to extricate from one another. On the one hand, there's a strong incentive for the Democratic leadership class and its media surrogates to speak a certain way about, the right and the conservative movement in the Republican Party. And, even down to kind of more granular things like kind of fundraising, right? Anyone who's written fundraising emails before themselves knows that you're not going to harvest donations if you use kind of a language of moderation. That's not how modern fundraising works, particularly when it comes to political campaigns. So there are market incentives for this kind of stuff. But then on the flip side, there is a genuine threat from the right to American democracy, democracy in a very basic kind of small d sense. As for the contradiction in what Democrats say versus what they do, I think that's a little more straightforward. I think the catalyst to the piece you just quoted that I did in The Atlantic, I think that was in October of 2020, was a press conference that Nancy Pelosi gave. And this was around the time of the Amy Coney Barrett appointment, when Democrats were not attempting at all to hold up this, the appointment of this judge, which if the tables were turned and there was a Democratic administration who was going to do the same thing in those circumstances, you can bet that the Republicans would have done everything they could to obstruct that nomination. But furthermore, this was back when Donald Trump, as we're a few weeks before the election at that point, and Donald Trump was refusing to say whether he would accept, election results, in the event he was defeated. And Pelosi began her press conference by saying something like, Mr. Trump, Mr. President, we're not in North Korea. This is America. You can't do this. And then I think a few minutes later, she was asked, if the Democrats were planning to shut down the government to hold up Amy Coney Barrett's nomination. And she said no, obviously. And she had this, if I'm remembering rightly, this completely cop-out reasoning, which was that federal workers need to get their checks, something like that. Obviously, that's not the reason. And so, here you have the contradiction, illustrated quite elegantly. On the one hand, we're told that, the Fourth Reich is coming to America, basically. And then on the other hand, the Democratic Party is still kind of cleaving to, all the norms around kind of, how Congress is supposed to function, all this kind of etiquette and politeness and respect for, bipartisanship and things like that. And that's a through line that you can see, running through the Trump era, really, where there's that type of rhetoric on the one hand, and then on the other, Democrats are approving Donald Trump's, judicial nominees. They are approving his, fast tracking in some cases, his military budgets. They're willing to vote to give an administration he leads new spying powers. And so in terms of how I would explain that contradiction, I really just think that the Democratic Party is a contradictory formation. It's one which represents the ostensibly kind of liberal, reform-minded, progressive side of the American political spectrum, but and has many voters in its coalition who indeed do kind of have those values, and values, I think, in many cases, much closer to a Bernie Sanders or at least an Elizabeth Warren than a Joe Biden or a Chuck Schumer or a Nancy Pelosi. But on the other hand, the Democratic Party, is in many ways an extension of Wall Street, an extension of the liberal wing of American capital, and as such, it is completely wedded to certain norms of behavior. And there are, political behavior and etiquette and otherwise, but also its room to maneuver and its willingness to move things in a particular direction, in a leftward direction, is severely constrained by the donors it embraces and by the kind of model that its leadership class embraces. So as a result, you get this contradiction where on the one hand, the barbarians are at the gates, and fascism has to be stopped at all costs, and on the other hand, the solution to that is always just more. It's always just another round of centrism.
Right.
And just to follow up, and I apologize if this is kind of a repetitive question, but what's so puzzling to me is not willing to use power even for their own narrow self-interest. So of course we know why they're not going to use power to pass Medicare for all, because they don't want to. But even something like, holding on to power or stopping voter suppression because they know that's going to hurt their electoral chances. You would think, if anything, they would understand the concept of wanting to hold on to power. So what kind of explains something so clearly in their self-interest, still not able and willing to use power to do that?
Well, the voting rights example is really interesting, because if you look at the way that, the kind of liberal media ecosystem, has covered voting rights, whether we're talking about MSNBC, Chris Hayes actually cited a piece that I wrote on voting rights that I wrote at The Atlantic on his show, which is not the kind of thing that happens every day. Ari Berman over at Mother Jones, who's a really excellent reporter, longstanding reporter on issues around voting rights and democracy. He's written extensively about this, and the liberal media ecosystem, to its credit, has I think treated the issue quite seriously. And as a result, they've gotten some noises from particular Democratic politicians around this stuff. They have not gotten a lot of action. And here, I think, the explanation is perhaps complicated. There are, I think, different factors at play, but I really think the simplest and most straightforward explanation here is that Joe Biden in particular, as those of us on the left, we always said that he would behave like this. The best way to predict a politician's behavior is to look at their record. And Joe Biden had almost 50 years of political history for us to look at. And, as my colleague Branko Markotic, who I know has been on this show before, wrote in his excellent book, Yesterday's Man, Joe Biden really does believe very deeply, he's a creature of the Beltway. He's a creature of its norms and its etiquette. And he, and I think many of the people around him, some of whom, kind of have their roots in the Obama-Biden administration, they really do believe, and this it sounds silly to say out loud, and it will be self-evident to, I suspect, every person watching and to the two of you why this is ridiculous, but they really do believe and have said as much that voters will reward them for passing bipartisan legislation and for kind of tempering down partisan divisions and things like that. They see this as in their self-interest. And if you look at the rhetoric coming out of people like Joe Manchin, who of course has been at the center of the democratic reform and voting rights controversies because of his unwillingness to discuss smashing the filibuster and things like that. It's all about how we need a middle path. Voting rights cannot be a partisan issue, et cetera, et cetera. And I think the people who say that stuff, frankly, really do believe in it. They really believe that that's true. And of course, when one party is actively working to suppress the rights of voters, particularly African-American voters, voting rights very much is a partisan issue. And I think that is getting lost in the, in the same old embrace, the same old kind of quintessentially Joe Biden embrace of, bipartisanship for its own sake as an end in itself and as something that, Biden and the people around him rather chaotically believe is going to yield them some kind of electoral advantage in the midterms, which I think is ludicrous.
And what's so frustrating about that is like that idea of if we pass bipartisan legislation, we'll get rewarded, is that there's a version of that I think we could agree with. And, the Bernie approach of if we pass overwhelmingly popular universal programs that ordinary Republicans, moderates would like, you'll be rewarded. But of course, that's not the version of this that they're talking about. They're talking about this much more narrow sense of that.
That's right. I mean, bipartisanship, there's a lot of fudging of there's a lot of fudging of words and what they mean around to put it bluntly around bipartisanship, because people like Manchin, when they invoke this concept, they're always kind of the insinuation is always, the implication is always that somehow they're talking about doing things that are overwhelmingly popular. And I think you find that's very rarely the case. When people who are fond of bipartisanship in the sense that it's generally invoked, when they cite it, what they're talking about is legislation that's popular within the political class. Mm-hmm. I mean, healthcare is a perfect example of that. To step away from voting rights for a second, I mean. Sanders, who is the only candidate to actually run on in a full-throated way without equivocation on Medicare for all during the primaries, was, bludgeoned from all sides by the people who, say we need moderation, compromise, bipartisanship, et cetera. And I know that, people will say that the polling around Medicare for all is, conflicted, or that, people don't understand what they're voting for. But you can go through years of polling that show there is majority support. I mean, and if we're just talking about the Democratic Party and registered Democrats, I mean, the support is absolutely overwhelming. In some cases, as high as 90%. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that I think a lot of rank and file Democrats probably thought that most candidates running in the primary supported some version of universal health care, and yet, Medicare for all hardly has a hearing at all within the Democratic Party. So, when moderates, so-called moderates, talk about what's popular and what's non-controversial, I think usually what they're talking about is things that are popular and non-controversial within the political class, not things that are popular and controversial and non-controversial within the electorate at large.
If you like this video from The Jacobin Show, please hit like and subscribe and share with your friends. Thanks.